Good evening. This is an interview with Fidelbogen for MGTOW magazine. Fidelbogen, you are the owner and operator of the Counter-Feminist blog, found at counterfem.blogspot.ca.
That's right.
And you've got a YouTube channel, which is found at youtube.com/user/Fidelbogen. You've been doing this for about 10 years, and what you've been doing is addressing feminism from a point of view that is somewhat unique and perhaps not yet well understood. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Okay, well, first off, I have been blogging since 2006, so that's not quite 10 years, but let's just say I've had my head in the game for a good 10 years, if not a bit more. As to what's unique, well, at the time I started blogging, I was one of the first people that I'm aware of that tried to put all of this critique and complaint about the situation onto something like a systematic or even a philosophical footing. At that time, it seemed like it was just pretty much a lot of people venting, expressing their anger and their frustration with the situation, and not a lot of coherence to it. And I was trying to bring some kind of intellectual law and order to the whole thing.
So what you're doing is you are doing a critique of the feminist ideology.
Yes, partly that. It goes beyond that. I'm not just critiquing the feminist ideology on its own terms. I am, as the name counter-feminist might imply, I am actually, and it took me a while to work this out, but I am actually trying to create a space which transcends feminism, from which to look at feminism as a whole, as a big, round social organism embedded in the social ecology from an outside space, an outside perspective, from a view of otherness or alterity.
Do you come from a particular political stance, such as liberalism, conservatism? Is this based on more generalized politics?
It really is not plugged into politics. If by politics you mean partisan politics, like Democrat, Republican, that sort of thing. That doesn't enter into my thinking much as far as my own analysis goes. Now, when I'm thinking about strategy, about what to do, about how to possibly build a movement, then of course I do take those things into consideration, because it's part of the situation map, it's part of the terrain that we've got to deal with.
So why do you do this?
Because I think feminism is just a really, really nasty thing, and somebody needs to speak out against it, and somebody might as well be me. I mean, if it's not me, who will it be?
So, what do you think are some of the more important components of feminism that the average person doesn't hear about? The coffee shop feminist, the university student, the middle-aged mother of 2 children who view feminism as nothing more but a fight for equality between men and women.
Well, these people that you've referred to, they have their heads stuffed with cliches for the most part. As to what they haven't heard about, well, what I would do is I would take a few talking points or concepts that they maybe have heard about, and then dig a little deeper into them, getting to a layer that maybe they haven't heard about. Now, just to break down what I think feminism is, and I could go on and on about that,
right.
And it's hard to pick just one or two things because there's so many things I could pick. But feminism, to give it a brief working definition, not a final definition, but a working definition just to get things rolling, that would be: feminism is the project to increase the power of women with no clearly stated upper limit or endpoint.
The project to increase the power of women with no clearly defined end to it. What are elements of this what ideas bring you to this conclusion?
What brings me to that conclusion is just reasoning forwards and backwards and inside and out, looking at the whole beast holistically. And I tried to find some kind of a common thread, some kind of a common factor that seemed to bind the whole mess together. And it seems like a very incoherent mess. It seems like feminism is a bunch of different things that contradict each other, and they do, and yet on a deeper level they don't. But the binding factor, as it occurred to me, was that one thing constant to all of feminism is that it seeks to increase the power of women, or as the phrase goes, to empower women. And I think it's probably equally justifiable to define feminism as synonymous with female supremacism.
What's wrong with women having more power?
Nothing wrong with women having more power, depending on what the power is, power for what purpose, power in what context, power to what end. And while we're speaking of the word end, I mean, where does it end? And then you've got to ask questions like, well, why? Why does anybody need more power?
Well,
I mean, it's the idea of saying we just need to empower women. That is so glib.
The sense of power, scientifically and practically, is the ability to move things. And I think that if we look back in history, we hear a narrative of how women since the inception of time have been oppressed and subjugated by males. And that this is the very foundation, it's the foundational element of feminism, that women are oppressed and or subjugated. Now,
that idea is problematic on a number of levels.
And why is that?
Well, when you start to drill into it, women have been oppressed by men. I mean, you can dig into it, and if you keep digging, you can look at ways that maybe women were not so oppressed. You can take women's experience throughout history and lay it side by side with men's, and you can see that men had it pretty bad. And it becomes really, really tricky to say who is oppressing whom. And we could get into this question from another angle just in modern day times, but basically, to my mind, the only way that we could realistically and usefully sort out this whole question of who is oppressed or who is not oppressed or who is more oppressed is if we could somehow objectively quantify the question of human misery on both the male side and the female side and see whose misery index stacks up higher in the long run. And that's hard to do. In fact, I would submit that's impossible.
If I understand you correctly, are you essentially saying that the historical backdrop isn't the backdrop of male privilege, but rather that it's interconnected, independent divisions of labor that place a burden both on men and women and grants them both the rights necessary to fulfill these duties?
That would be a simplified way of putting it, yes, for convenience.
What would you think are some other binding markers to support the notion that feminism may not be what it is popularly understood as?
Okay, getting back more into the here and now, it is said to be a movement for equality. Well, the word equality itself is problematic as hell. It is, as Nick Redding put it recently, it's intellectual cotton candy. Now, what is this thing called equality, really? And that's a whole philosophical discussion that could go on for an hour, I'm sure. But something that's really troubling that we don't hear people talking about much, or at least not in a really focused form like I'm trying to formulate it here, that is the question of holding women morally accountable. Okay, some have used the term female hypoagency, the idea that women are just pretty much given a pass, are let off light, not treated like they have any moral agency, which in effect amounts to not treating them like adults. But the thing that would be a real killer, a real game stopper, a real let the air out of the tires thing for feminism would be if feminism, in its discourse, in its whole conversation, at some point, began to seriously tackle the question of the moral accountability of women, began to seriously talk about and think about, well, how do we hold women morally accountable? Do women do bad things? Are women capable of doing bad things? When something goes wrong between a man and a woman and there's some question as to who's at fault or who the real troublemaker was or where the trouble started, do we lay the blame on him or do we lay the blame on her? And we can see that the traditional feminist default response is to instinctively, reflexively try to find a way to get women off the hook, to say it wasn't really her fault. Some convoluted theory will ride to the rescue to convince us that really it's him who was the culprit, or that it was this thing which they call the patriarchy, which structurally defined and politicized their relationships in such a way that women could not effectively do wrong, even when they appear to do wrong.
An example of that, I suppose, would be battered woman syndrome.
Battered woman syndrome, it's not a scientific thing, that battered woman syndrome. But yeah, I suppose that would be an example.
Are you saying that one of the root elements of feminism is lack of accountability, the willful and deliberate lack of accountability on women's part, and that this is part and parcel of what feminism is about?
It is part and parcel of what feminism is about. As to whether it's a root element, that could be talked about a little bit. I think what I would emphasize and what I would like to impress upon anybody who's listening here as a takeaway point is that if feminism in the person of its highest writers and thought leaders ever seriously came to grips with the whole question of women being held morally accountable, in very short order the whole feminist project would collapse, and that would be the end of it. And we can dig into that question a little bit more, because it is interesting.
Why don't we do so?
Okay, go back to the beginning. Feminism is the project to increase the power of women. Now, it's always doing that. As we said, there's no clearly understood, clearly stated endpoint. It appears to be, from all we can see, that it is an infinite game. They're not thinking about any kind of end game, any kind of exit plan. Now, if that's the case, and so far I can't see any evidence that it's not, you are virtually forced, virtually constrained to let women off the hook for bad behavior, to hold women innocent and morally unaccountable. Once you start seriously holding women morally accountable, once you assume, say for example, that about half the time she's wrong, about half the time he's wrong, and you drill into the particular cases, the everyday microcosm of life, well, then there is a limit to how far you can empower women. To empower somebody infinitely, power corrupts. You have to give them the power to do about anything they want.
Power without consequences is the very recipe for corruption.
Yes.
Are you suggesting that feminism is a corrupt ideology, or that it is an ideology that promotes corruption?
That's a very interesting way you put it. I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but yes, I can see where it very much does promote a kind of corruption, a moral corruption, I guess you would call it. Just holding women morally accountable, saying women are capable of doing wrong, even seriously preaching that women should do right, women should treat men ethically. If the feminist thought leaders were putting out that message consistently and regularly, that would put a very tight limit on how far you could push the feminist project.
What I find interesting in what you're saying is that if we consider what I'm hearing you say is that if feminism is merely an ongoing project to keep increasing women's power, and which women, but let's just say women in general, if it is to increase women's power without end, without limit, and that it has no accountability, and that it is corruption, the inverse of that would be what?
The inverse of that? I'm not quite sure what you mean by the inverse of that.
The opposite of corruption would be fairness, wouldn't it?
Yes, fairness, and they might bring up the word equality, which is so very fair sounding.
What we actually have, based on what you're telling me, is a movement where people are preaching equality to cover corruption. How are they getting away with this?
How are they getting away with it? Boy, that's a can of worms all by itself. They're getting away with it because a lot of people just aren't too bright. A lot of people have had the wool pulled over their eyes, and a lot of people are supporting them one way or the other. They're in cahoots with them one way or the other. And I know that's a kind of gloomy and cynical way of looking at it, but at this point I don't see any way out of it, quite frankly.
Well, it does sound rather sinister, you have to admit. How do you feel the charges of people who would accuse you of being a cynic, or who would accuse you of being a conspiracy theorist?
Well, a conspiracy theorist, what is a conspiracy theorist? What is a conspiracy? Do I think a bunch of people sat down around an oak table in a smoke-filled room somewhere and worked all this stuff out? No, not necessarily.
Feminism is the drive to create boundless and unaccountable power for women. How do you explain that men are involved in this? Because wouldn't this work against their interests?
It would work against their interests. And as to their involvement, did I say any of this was rational? Did I say any of this was based on intelligence? There are men out there who are clearly profiting from this, and their reasons are varied. This is another can of worms right here.
If you had a magic wand and you could just wave it and you'd have a number of important social, political elements change overnight, what would they be?
Well, to express this in terms of actual projects or policies or reforms that might be put forward, it's hard to narrow it down to, I guess, three things. Where would I start? I would start with this business of false accusation. And when I say false accusation, I'm thinking mainly accusation of rape, because that's the most famous thing that everybody's talking about these days. That's the big thing.
Violence.
Well, there's accusation of rape, there's accusation of violence. That is something that empowers women. Women being able to falsely accuse men gives them great power over men. That would give anybody power over anybody if you could point a finger and say he did that and wreck their life or send them to prison. But I'm thinking more specifically of accusations of rape. And, well, I would make a few simple reforms. And just to narrow this down, because I could go on and on, I would reform the proceedings of rape trials in the courtroom. I would restore the practice of reading Sir Matthew Hale's warning to the jury. Sir Matthew, this is instructions, a passage written from Sir Matthew Hale, who was a legal scholar, jurist from the 17th century, the 1600s. Once upon a time, it was the custom to read this to the jury before they went into seclusion to work on their verdict. Mm-hmm. It's very brief. It says, rape is an accusation easily to be made, hard to be proved, and harder yet to be defended by the party accused, though never so innocent. And it was, back in the day, customary to read this to the jury before the jury went to make their decision.
I see.
And I think it's a good thing. This was part of the wreckage. This went by the wayside in the wake of feminist innovation during the 1980s. It is no longer the custom to read Hale's warning to the jury.
So in short, it's a warning that alerts the jurist to the potential of mudslinging and to base their verdict on evidence rather than hearsay or emotion.
Yes, and the possibility of wrongful accusation. Right. Because, I mean, it is easy to make an accusation of rape. It's hard to prove it. I mean, how many rapes are performed in front of witnesses? Not very doggone many.
And now that we have a constantly shifting definition of what rape is, not
so much shifting as constantly expanding like ripples on a pond.
Well, I agree. In Canada, there is no charge of rape. There is no such legal charge. It's known as sexual assault. It has 3 levels, and these 3 levels all have very specific markers. For example, the least level of sexual assault might be something like groping someone without their consent, whereas level 3 would be the most outrageous kind, would be a violent, battering sexual assault. So every one of these levels has their own specific identifying markers as to be able to determine what level of sexual assault this is that the individual is being charged for, rather than the vague term of rape.
Well, I see they've conflated violence with sexual assault there, or with rape. Well, from your description.
Yes. Well, I don't know if they've conflated it, but these are markers for levels of sexual violence.
And you're saying that rape, the term rape, does not even exist in criminal law in Canada, or in criminal justice procedure?
No, that's correct. In Canada, there are 3 levels of sexual assault. Mm-hmm. So when you go to the police and say, I was raped, well, they'll start asking very specific questions so that they can know what the charge is. Is it sexual assault level 1, 2, or 3? It's much in the sense that there's a distinction between manslaughter and first-degree murder. You know, one requires, the former is almost negligent, whereas the latter implies deliberate intent, planning, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
What would be some other elements that if you could just wave a magic wand you would change and that would make a positive difference to our society regarding the situation that we currently have created by the adherence to feminist ideology?
I would definitely fix the situation with divorce and have joint custody as a default.
As a default.
When they're deciding who gets custody of the kids, no more of this, the mother gets it most of the time and the man doesn't. It should be default joint custody, and if there's some reason to give it to him or some reason to give it to her, they can go from there, they can flex from there. But joint custody should be the standard. That would make things fair, that would get fathers back into the lives of their children, which would make a lot of feminists very unhappy, but I think would make regular people more happy in the long run and have a happy outcome for the world in general.
In a sense, it would be undoing some of the work that feminists have worked towards dismantling the nuclear family.
Yes, dismantling the nuclear family, breaking up marriage, and demonizing men and enslaving men. Because after all, that's what happened. What happens to a father who is cut off from his kids? He's still expected to support them under onerous conditions, under, sometimes conditions akin to slavery. And then for all his pains, he gets called a deadbeat.
So we're still on the magic wand thing. The first thing that you would do is you would have a warning read to the jury.
Yes, Matthew Hale's warning.
Another element would be, so your 3 points are your warning. The second would be default.
Well, no, the default thing is a separate item. The first item breaks down into 2 parts. One is the read the warning to the jury. The second one would be raise the standard of evidence, make good and damn sure that it's either clear and convincing standard or beyond a reasonable doubt. And I haven't quite worked out in my own mind which of those would be better. But preponderance of evidence, that's not going to work.
And preponderance of evidence is plus
51%, yeah. Well, if the evidence weighs 51% in favor of the conclusion, that's preponderance of evidence, which means there's 49% that doesn't. That's pretty bad. And in so many rape trials, it's just he said, she said. And I'm going to be very frank with you here. I think that I think we have a choice here. It's kind of a devil's choice, you might call it. Either we can get more rapists, we can imprison more rapists, or we can let the innocent go free. Okay, if you're going to go and nail more rapists, you're going to get more innocent people. If you want to protect the innocent, then you're going to let more guilty rapists go. I don't think there really is a solution here, and if I'm wrong, I wish somebody would please tell me.
And this is something that has to be contended with in all cases, whether it be rape or theft or murder or any other. I can understand that.
Except in the case of rape, rape is really hard to prove. Some of those other crimes, there's evidence, there's witnesses. Rape, like I said earlier, how many rapes are witnessed? Typically, there's 2 people present, and it's in court, it's his word against hers. Who are you going to believe? Why should you inherently believe the woman?
Why should the accuser have more power and less accountability than the accused? Which, if I were to tack something on to what you've mentioned, I would tack on another change where either both people are named in the media, in the case of a rape trial, where it's John Doe versus Jane Doe, that either both persons' name are mentioned or that neither people's names are mentioned. Because what you have in the case where only the accused is named, but the accuser is not, we once again have a lack of accountability and the power to point the state at an individual to bring their force to bear upon the accused, plus that of the media's. So by either having both named or neither named, we rebalance it.
We do rebalance it. I'm glad you brought that up. I wonder why I didn't think to mention that. But yes, this smearing the accused's name all over the media, that's got to stop.
What would be some other things that you would bring to bear if you could?
Well, I mentioned default joint custody. I would like to see somehow more intellectual freedom on college campuses. And I would even love to see somebody start a, quote, intellectual freedom movement on campuses.
Aren't universities the very epitome of freedom of thought? Are you saying that this is not the case?
In theory they are, but we have seen that they are not. I mean, anybody who is up to speed with all the various shindigs that happened in Toronto in the last couple of years knows what the score is on college campuses, and it's not just confined to to Toronto and places like that. I mean, it's everywhere. There is a hegemony of thought on college campuses in general. It's authoritarian left. It's very feminist.
The so-called political correctness movement.
So-called political correctness, yes, for lack of a better term.
Right.
But there is a definite structure of thought that people pretty much need to stay within, and if you think different, you need to keep it to yourself. There's just not a lot of freedom there's freedom of thought, but there's not a lot of freedom to voice your thoughts.
Don't stand against the prevalent narrative.
Right. As Janice Fiamengo discovered when she said things against feminism and against women's studies, they didn't like that. I mean, these are things anybody ought to be able to do. If you don't like feminism or any other ideology and you have a case to make against it, you ought to be free to do so. And yet we see this is not the case. And it's really important that this has happened on college campuses in the world of post-secondary education, because that is such a powerful sector of society. This is where the leaders are formed and given their mental injections of ideas. And then these are the people that are going to go out and become the politicians, et cetera, et cetera.
The movers and shakers.
The movers and shakers, that's right. And feminism really has the world of post-secondary education on lockdown. And we non-feminists, I won't say anti-feminists, but I will say non-feminists, need to establish our beachhead in that world of post-secondary education. And we see that there's a turf war going on, and they're going to be fighting tooth and nail to keep us out. In the case of the male studies movement, I don't know if you're familiar with that or not.
Tell us about it.
Oh, the male studies movement they had a meeting at Wagner College on Staten Island back in April of 2010 to introduce a new curriculum at the university level called male studies, not to be confused with men's studies, which already exists in many places and is just an extension of feminism. It's feminist-based, ideologically wedded to feminism. But
right.
Male studies is a discipline which is dedicated to studying the, shall we say, the phenomenology of men or males from the vantage point of the male lived experience. And though they don't always say it, basically from a non-feminist vantage point.
This is the study of men qua men, devoid of an ideological drive, the actual scholastic study of what men experience or place in society without an overriding framework, an overriding ideological framework.
Without an a priori ideological framework, yes. This is, well, one would hope, honest sociology, and based on empirical evidence and so on, and hopefully respectful of the male experience, that not from the outset defining men as the problem or defining masculinity as broken in some way.
Now, are you saying that somebody had started this and it has been opposed, or merely that it's been opposed before it even got started?
Well, it's been opposed. I'm sure if it was, opposed before it got started. If it didn't exist, I don't think anybody was opposing it. But as soon as it became generally known, as soon as it got into the news, into the media, people found out about it. Boy, were they opposing it. I mean, the feminists went after it like piranhas. They didn't want that. It's an ongoing movement. They're still pushing it. They tried to get into a university in Australia. I forget which one, but they got pushed out.
If I look at your points, what I see is an overriding theme where what you would advocate for above all is accountability, critical thinking, evidence-based decision-making, and overall fairness. These would be the substances of the magic that you would wave out of your wand.
In an ideal world, yes. We can go on with that. As far as the methodology I recommend in fighting this war.
A cultural war.
It is a cultural war, yes.
Well, going back to the university thing, I'm reminded of the young woman, I forget her name. She's often nicknamed as Mattress Girl. She's
Emma Sulkowicz is her name.
That's right. What do you think of that whole situation?
I am inclining to believe that she was not raped. I'm inclining to think that she pretty much made this story up. And the reason I say that is because I know the emails that passed between her and the young man who supposedly assaulted her. That would be, I think his name is Matthew Nungaser. The friendly, chatty, flirty emails that passed between them, which totally does not comport with a rape victim communicating with her rapist. that's just so glaringly contradictory.
And if I recall, didn't she go to the police?
I don't recall if she went to the police or not, but I know that she did go to the university authorities, and they found no basis or no merit to her claim.
Right.
Whoever she went to, nobody found any merit to her claim. She had no evidence, obviously, and apparently they had a sexual relationship, those two. But whether he ever raped her or sexually assaulted her or whatever you want to call it, that, to my mind, looks doubtful. And so she, for God only knows what reason, decided to take up this performance art thing with the mattress.
That is, she's carrying a mattress around everywhere she goes while on university campus.
Yes, including into her classes, and she's going to carry it onto the stage when she graduates and all of that. But the other thing that's interesting here is that she got a couple of other women at the college there to say that, yes, they were assaulted by this young man. Now, of course, their claims were not found to have any merit. I mean, we don't seem to have any real evidence. We have one claim, Emma's claim, that looks really fishy, really flaky, and then we have a couple of others, but there's no real evidence of this, and so it was rejected, but yet Emma wants Matthew to be kicked out of Columbia. And she's just dragging his name through the mud, making his life hell, and who knows what the repercussions for him will be down the years in his career and other life prospects. What's interesting here is that we have three women who teamed up, and I know I'm sounding cynical here, but who teamed up to accuse a man of rape.
And that's not at all unusual. The Cosby case comes to mind that has similarities of a male being accused of rape by several women, or by more than one woman, a long time after the fact, no solid evidence, yet it goes viral in the media.
Well, in the Cosby case, it was spectacular. The total count now has gone over 30. Okay. Yes, it was 26 for a while, and now it's gone up to, I think, 30, or maybe a little bit over 30. But let me emphasize, I don't know if Bill Cosby was guilty or innocent. He may have been guilty. He may have been guilty for some of them, innocent for some of those charges, innocent for some of the others. He may have been guilty for none of them. He may have been guilty for all of them.
Just don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. I'm not going to come out and say, I think he was innocent. Those bitches were lying. No, I'm not going to say that.
But this brings us back to the point we discussed earlier. Wouldn't it be a fairness if accountability and responsibility were equal to both parties, and in the media that both be named or neither be named?
Yes, that would be good in this case, and I think it's a pretty bad situation that this was named in the media, or that this got into the media. These accusations against Bill Cosby got into the media at all. It's a tough call here, because I'm pretty sure that the statute of limitations is expired for most of those alleged rapes, if not all of them at this point. So what are they going to do?
Now, are you claiming that any of these things are tied in specifically with feminism? Because if we look back a little bit if we look at the path that we kind of came down, we talked about where feminism is, from your point of view, the unending quest for power without accountability. We have cases of intellectual liberty being trampled on and actively fought about. We have examples of this happening in university. Though I didn't mention it, I was the situation with Sage Gerard and KSU men came to mind. We have this case with Emma. I keep wanting to say Emma Watson.
Salkowitz.
Salkowitz, thank you. We see this trend repeating over and over of accusations being made, taken seriously, taken almost as if the accusation were a de facto conviction. Are you claiming that there's a tie-in between this kind of behavior and feminism, or is this merely people acting poorly?
Let me quickly fold into the mix Duke Lacrosse and the University of Virginia. I got to mention those. Anyway, bad. Well, it is people acting badly. I mean, certainly it is that. Now, your question is what? How does it tie in with feminism?
Does it tie into feminism, in your opinion?
Well, it does, in the sense that feminists have had plenty to say about all this. I mean, feminists are talking up a storm about this. Clearly, they have an interest. So, yeah, it ties in with feminism, because it ties in with feminists. And feminists bring the lens of their ideology to bear upon their discussion of the issues.
Are you claiming that this may or may not have anything to do with feminist ideology per se, but that feminists are opportunistically using it as a propaganda tool?
They are undoubtedly opportunistically using it as a propaganda tool. As to whether it ties in with feminist ideology per se, you'd have to ask the question, well, which feminist ideology are you talking about? Because there's so many of them out there floating around. And you could certainly find some feminist writer somewhere who would not have any of this specifically written into her ideology. But this is where the conversation gets even more complex and goes beyond the bounds of 1 hour, unfortunately.
What comes to my mind would be Anita Sarkeesian looking for reasons to call something as harmless as a video game, using this as an example, as a propagandist example of ways to promote the message in more and more niches.
In this case, the women are victims, and that if women are victims, we need to take more and more drastic measures to remedy the situation. And said measures, of course, would translate into things that are detrimental to men. So as far as these rape cases, well, I mean, rape is just a big, huge thing with feminists, because it's such an emotional hot button with so many people that they are able to exploit it to the hilt. And boy, do they ever.
But are you suggesting that the average person can't see through this?
Well, the average person?
Because, in effect, if something is such an utter sham, would one think that the average individual is incapable of seeing through something so blatantly false? If that's the case, why aren't they? Why is this message being promoted?
Well, I would have to ask, am I the average individual? Are you the average individual? Who is the average individual? I think there's a lot of people out there that see through it. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people who either don't see through it or don't want to see through it for dark and complex psychological reasons that we can't really get into right now.
Right.
And clearly, this is very polarizing. There's huge emotion upon this subject. It's a flashpoint.
And there's no greater way to control the masses than to polarize them.
Yes, to control the masses. As for people not seeing through it, I think a lot of people see through it. The problem is that the counter-feminist voice, let us call it, the opposition to the hegemonic or controlling discourse at this point is simply not organized. It's a bunch of different voices that don't really have a voice. It's a bunch of people that are caught in this trap of silence. They know it, but they don't have the power to speak out. They don't have the megaphone, if you will.
Right. And so this then is your reason for having created your blog and for having created your YouTube channel. Is that right?
I suppose that's part of the reason. In my small way, I think maybe I wanted to help counteract that effect. Yes.
All right. Well, are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to bring to bear that we might not have thought to bring up?
If I had to wrap up the non-feminist revolution in one simple phrase, one little nutshell, it is feminism is what we say it is. Now, we take control of the meaning of the word feminism. And we, from our non-feminist vantage point, which is something I alluded to, I think, early on in the program, the alterity, non-feminist alterity, we call it. From the standpoint of non-feminist alterity, we see feminism from outside of feminism, and our standpoint is as authoritatively definitive as anything a feminist would say about the situation from within the framework of feminism. Feminism is what we say it is. The most important thing to understand is that we are defining feminism, and when we say we define feminism, we're defining not only that little one-sentence definition that I gave you, but this goes on and on. We are describing it and fully mapping it to its full extent.
Right. As
a social phenomenon, and as something extended through the culture. Feminism is what we say it is.
Feminism is what we say it is. And on that note, thank you for your time, Fidelbogen. Anybody who's interested in learning more about Fidelbogen can find his blog at counterfem.blogspot.com. Find his YouTube channel at youtube.com/users/Fidelbogen. And thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure being here.
This was an interview with Fidelbogen for MGTOW Magazine and Francis Roy.